The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the guest's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of AIHA. AIHA does not endorse any guest or the entity that they represent. On this episode of Healthier Workplaces, we discuss a new normal of hot and smoky with our guest, Mona Shum.
We have a certain way of doing things that is that was really brought to light during COVID, right? We had never heard of hierarchy of controls before in the general media prior to COVID, at least I hadn't. So bringing that to light and using those skills, the ability to think through risk assessment and control to these emerging issues, such as this climate change issue, in particular with the wildfire smoke and heat stress. I think if we can do that and start to frame it in the way we be framing all these sorts of hazards in industrial environments.
Meet Alice Hamilton. She was an early pioneer in what we know today as industrial hygiene. Her work had a profound impact on AIHA's earliest members. AIHA's Hamilton Club recognizes organizations that continue her work. These corporate partners use innovation and expertise to shape the future of worker health and safety. Partners receive tiered benefits of access, recognition, contribution, and brand exposure. The Hamilton Club is the center of support and investment between club partners, AIHA, and its members. This is where the future of the profession shines the brightest. For more information, visit aiha.info/Hamilton Club.
Welcome, Mona, to the Healthier Workplaces show. Really
Thank you.
important topic, talking about climate change and how it affects occupational health and safety professionals.
So I think right now we have an emerging issue that affects all of us, and really climate change is affecting different occupations. And currently, as occupational hygienists or industrial hygienists, we're faced with a sort of a new issue that we really haven't had to deal with much in the past. And so how we're seeing this manifest itself is in heat stress and wildfires, and so namely wildfire smoke. And so that's really the topic of today's discussion, is really that aspect of what we're having to deal with as industrial hygienists.
So we're dealing with people, gig workers, that sort of thing. We've had that discussion on previous episodes. People that are out, perhaps maybe not under the coverage of having an organization that they work for that has really good environmental health and safety capacity. But
Right.
this is true for everyone, though, right? This is all
Yes.
sectors of work.
All
So
sectors of work. I think where we have struggled in the past few years is really trying to figure out how to measure the hazard, how to assess the risk, and then what to do about it, because it is an emerging issue for all of us, and it's becoming more and more commonplace that we here in the north, in British Columbia, are experiencing more and more hot summers, a number of wildfires through the summer, not only in our province but also in surrounding provinces and states. So we've been having to deal with these issues, and when I first started dealing with them a number of years ago, we were a little caught off guard, right? Because we were thinking, oh, okay, well, we're not going to compare to our occupational health guidance, really, because there isn't that much guidance on wildfire smoke in that literature. So we had to start looking at public health guidelines. And so it was a little bit of a different animal for us. And so I felt that it was really important to take what we learned as industrial hygienists and apply it to a slightly different environment and a different population too, because we have, I work a lot with the film industry. And so in that population, we have people who are in the cast that are young, very young, and very old, and who have all sorts of different vulnerabilities as well, right? So it's a different population than what we normally deal with. as industrial hygienists, we normally work with a working population that's fairly healthy, right? Being able to go to work, and we don't normally deal with the extremes in ages and vulnerabilities. So anyways, it was an interesting environment to be in, and then having to deal with not only wildfire smoke but also the heat that comes with it oftentimes. And so we were having to kind of come up with new ways of looking at it, taking old approaches, I guess.
Well, I mean, and this wildfires on the west coast of North America are not a new thing, but obviously they've been becoming more severe and greater occurrence, right? I mean, we're
Definitely.
this is over the last several years we just see more and more and more of this. Um, so let's talk about some of the ways that from your perspective and how from the occupational health and safety perspective we can deal with it. So you mentioned using public health guidelines instead of what would be classically used in like industrial settings, right? Just
Right, right. So that's what we had to do and apply to the film population, because they're often working outside as well. They're often filming outside, so we couldn't compare to like these really high occupational standards for just nuisance dust, right? That's going to be too high. We needed to think about how we could protect workers who are working in an outdoor environment, doing a film shoot, etc. So we started looking into the public health guidelines and using those as a starting off point. And then we actually had people measure, so we utilize some of the industrial hygiene techniques that we have to actually monitor on site, and we had sort of action plans at which level they'd have to start doing things, and maybe limiting their time outside, or sometimes not filming at all. So we actually helped develop these wildfire smoke plans for the industry, which was different, from what we had done in like a stationary plant where they work, regular shifts, and it's a bit of a different animal, as I was saying before.
Well, it seems like that would be especially challenging because especially you dealing in the film industry, you're going to be shooting at a variety of different locations, studio locations, on-site locations. They're all different. I mean, it's so
Yes,
to try to it's not as there's really not a one size fits all, right? So how do you create plans that can adapt to really varying conditions, varying locations, even varying times of the day, and like
sure.
it seems pretty complex.
Yeah, so what we ended up doing was taking those health guidelines and saying, really, we should choose this limit at which, there's an action that happens, and then maybe there's no outdoor filming, but indoor filming can still occur under these sorts of conditions, such as if you have a good filtration system on your HVAC system. Um, a lot of times, though, people work in these studios that are just warehouses, and they don't really have proper mechanical ventilation. So oftentimes people would just open the bay doors and things in between takes. But that doesn't really work. That might work from a heat stress perspective to try to get in some fresh air, but if you're bringing in wildfire smoke when you do that, so we had to look at maybe some solutions around localized ventilation scrubbers that would scrub the air, HEPA filters that would scrub the air inside the facility, to be able to clean the air that was already in there, and then have air conditioning units that also could try to reduce some of that outdoor air, unfiltered air coming in.
Now, what's interesting with that too is, with the HEPA filtration, you're dealing with the airborne particulate, which of course is a big constituent, right, of wildfire smoke. Uh, but if you're you get locked down in a recycle mode, now you're not dealing with any gaseous contaminants like carbon dioxide, for example, just from the people. If
Right.
if there's occupant density, I'm assuming in a big sound stage you've got so much volume there that maybe that's not a big issue, but perhaps it would be,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, no, definitely. You're exactly spot on, Bob, because well, we had to deal with COVID before, and sometimes we had to deal with COVID, heat stress, and wildfire smoke at the
Right.
same time. So all those three
Triple
things
threat.
mixed together. So some controls for one may not necessarily really jive with the other, right? So
Mhm.
we were finding like opening doors, opening windows wasn't the greatest thing for wildfire smoke, but might be better for heat and might be better for COVID reasons. Um, but then we had to find sort of a happy medium. So what we ended up doing also, from a COVID perspective, is when we use these HEPA filtration units, we were also measuring carbon dioxide, just to make sure we were getting proper amount of air exchange for other things. Right? So it was a fine line, and we had to sort of
Sure.
take what was reasonable, and we probably we didn't reach an ideal, which is, we wanted these 6 air changes per hour for COVID
Mm.
reasons and other things, but we had to also deal with special effects. They had fog that they were using, and we wanted to keep the fog inside the inside the studio. So it became sort of one layer upon another layer of having, as hygienists, having to be flexible, adaptable, trying to like do better than what was happening um, on set right then, but then realizing that ideal may not be totally achievable
Right,
under
right.
the circumstances. So I think we did our best in trying to like really trying to control some of those exposures, as well as making sure that we could still film. We could still film.
And one of the phrases that's really troubled me that's come off of COVID is the effective air change term. That term of
Mm-hmm.
because to me it still conflates the aspect of it's not really an air change. Because an effective air change is just going through air filtration device, and if they're just using a filtration device that has HEPA filtration and not doesn't do any gas sorbent capacity, it's not really an air change, right? It's
Right,
an air filtration cycle is really
right,
what it is,
right. And it's
but I
cleaning
think
only certain things. You're
and
right.
I think many people, general consumers, of course, don't really understand it. But I think even people a lot of people that are involved in the professional side of not people that are actually practitioners in your industry, but I'm thinking in terms of facility managers and people like that. I think they sometimes don't understand that as well. When they hear
Yes,
that.
yes. So, I mean, our ideal, of course, is to have a mechanical system, right? That's going to bring in filtered air. So we were wanting sort of MERV 13 rating, at least from a COVID perspective, and also from a particulate perspective. So MERV 13, if you can have mechanical ventilation, then you're bringing in fresh air that's filtered into your building. That helps take care of the wildfire smoke issue. Helps also circulate fresh air into the building from a COVID perspective. That's really the ideal. It's just when we had to work with some other buildings that really just weren't set up to do that, we had to use filtration, as well as, when we could, getting fresh air from outdoors by bringing it in through some kind of filtration system from outside.
So, right in the open, you mentioned, the concept of dealing with higher levels of potential heat stress.
Yes,
Take this is so this again. Now, I think this is something that this climate change is going to affect for all industries, for everything, right? Wildfire smoke is
yes,
a specific thing that's happening in certain geographic areas around the globe, and it's obviously becoming a horrific problem in many areas. But the heat stress issue really could be occurring everywhere, right?
definitely, definitely. And so we started getting brought into dealing with heat stress as well, because we do have good occupational regulation in that area here. So it's how do we convey that to like the film industry, for instance, and and have them come up with heat stress plans and control plans and things like that. So we've actually developed a digital app right now that will have help people measure their heat stress risk, and it's just a simple app that's based on the Humidex ratings that are acceptable here in British Columbia to use as one of the ways to measure heat stress. So it's actually made for the film industry, and it's for a particular union here, IATSE 891. But I can see it being utilized in many different places. It's asking you questions around what's the temperature, what's the relative humidity. You're supposed to use like a hygrometer or some kind of other measuring device to get that, because you want localized data. And then it walks you through questions. What are you wearing? What are you doing? Is it sort of high activity, high sort of load activity, or are you sitting down? That sort of thing. So it brings you through all of those, and then at the end of the day, you get a Humidex rating, and then what to do. That's the most important part. Like we refer back to our guidelines here in British Columbia about what to do when you get to these ratings. So it's all about, similar to what I was saying with wildfire plans, it's all about having a plan, and then having sort of, what are you going to do when things reach a certain level? You need to be able to give people some tools.
Well, what I would think would be really paramount is that this is an ongoing monitoring, right? You don't just take a snapshot one time a day and
That's
say everything's
correct.
fine because
Yes, yes.
conditions change just time of day, right? Uh,
Definitely, definitely. So with the for the wildfire smoke plan, for instance, we say to measure continuously when there is a wildfire smoke issue. And then with the heat stress, you're supposed to do it every hour, really, when there's a risk of heat stress. So, and you're supposed to sort of record what you're finding. So it's easy enough on an app. You can snap a screenshot and keep those for records. And we say where you are and what time it was, that sort of thing. So people can have those sorts of records that meet our guidelines here, but would be useful elsewhere as well.
And again, that app you said was developed for the film industry by a film
Yes,
union there in
yes,
Canada.
yes.
So let's look bigger picture. Some of the things you're discussing. How would you adapt or modify some of the things that you've taken into account in the film industry and
Mhm.
use them, more of a globally for industry for occupational health and safety professionals everywhere?
Well, something like this app can be utilized anywhere. Really, we've just modified some of the language. So we talk about, radiant heat being from the sun and maybe from very strong, high-powered lights that they would use in a studio. But essentially, that question could just flip back to, do you have any radiant heat sources such as the sun, or are you in a particular industrial environment? So I think the app can be used by really anyone. It's just simple wording modifications that need to happen. So we do want to, have that available to other people to utilize. It's based on the Humidex method, which may or may not be an acceptable method in different jurisdictions. I think it is here in Canada in certain jurisdictions, but maybe not in the United States. So I think something like that, though, using like the WIBJIT method, the wet bulb globe temperature method, which is um, utilized by industrial hygienists all over the world. That's something you could actually modify something like this to use that method instead of pointing to the Humidex. So and it would still provide controls and things like that, maybe in a more generic way, if you want it for more the general population or the general workforce, or you could maybe make it specific like we did here for the film industry in British Columbia. So I can see something like this, an app, just being very useful for a whole bunch of different uses. It just requires probably a little modification.
Yeah, and what's neat about having an app is again that's a readily available tool, right? You have
Right,
'cause if
right.
you have to go back to your desktop and you have to deal with it that way, that's
Yes,
not going to be. My understanding of this whole thing is this is really a field type practice. You have to be out in the
right.
field taking these readings, monitoring the conditions. So having a companion app that you can have on your smart device seems to make a lot of
Yeah,
sense.
that's what we're thinking. I mean, as industrial hygienists, we're always thinking, what's the next thing out there? I know people are trying to use technology a lot more, and not only for these types of applications, but also in general with air monitoring, because and not just air monitoring, noise and radiation and non-ionizing radiation, all those sorts of things as well. Because I find like some of the tools we utilize are like so outdated. I've had to find an Ethernet connection and a connector, and then go, what do I plug this into? I have nothing to plug it into, and a lot of our instrumentation is quite old. And I do know we're having some movement now into newer technologies, et cetera. But I think we could still do a lot more as an industrial hygiene community to really um, to be in the forefront of technology changes and
Sure.
sort of embrace them.
Well, yeah, it's. I think it's important because actually the people in the field will drive some of the innovation.
Hmm.
Because I mean I think we are in on the cusp of a really major technology shift for the sensing devices and the field equipment that we'll be using. But certainly, to have equipment that's user friendly, that's it's practical for people in the field, you really need the field practitioner input, right? You know,
Definitely, definitely. And I think also from our perspective, and I'm not sure in the United States if you have the similar issue, but we only have sort of standardized methods of air sampling and things like that that are acceptable
mhm.
to
And we as do we,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, for compliance reasons. So also trying to get these new sensor technologies and this sort of more direct reading instruments, et cetera, acceptable as compliance sampling. That would move the needle. Right, because
Yeah.
right now what we're stymied by is the fact that we do direct reading instruments, and we do direct reading measurements, but they're not compliant a lot of times, right?
Right.
And so then we have to do also NIOSH methods or OSHA
Right.
methods, et cetera, in alongside with our direct reading instruments, and then sort of um, um, make some assumptions around those direct reading instruments. And that's how we do it right now.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, and certainly that's not the most expeditious way to monitor certain conditions when you have to have laboratory analysis and things like that done. That's not
Right.
you're not in a real time mode. And I think with things such as wildfire, where we're dealing with it, it is a real time problem. It's a real time problem that constantly shifts, and you need to be able to on the fly know what's happening. So
Right. Right. And so we've had to adjust, especially in the film world, because we used to do a lot of fog monitoring, so atmospheric fog for effects. And we tried, or we proposed to do like NIOSH sampling with an air sampling pump and, media, etc. And that's was just not going to work on film sets because, first of all, people aren't going to wear them. They're loud. They take, a week or two to actually to get analyzed, so you can have results. It wasn't really an option for them. So that's when we developed things like these correction factors with these direct reading instruments, taking sort of a gold standard NIOSH method alongside like a direct reading instrument, and sort of formulating some kind of correction factor we could utilize in film sets actually during filming. And so that's sort of that new piece we'd love to be able to do and bring to other areas of industrial hygiene. And we are doing that. We're doing that in mining, and we're doing that in manufacturing, et cetera. But like I said, it's this tying it back to the NIOSH method. And is this an acceptable method? So far in the film industry, our regulator seems to accept that method with the direct reading instruments, because we've tied it back to that NIOSH method. Hopefully that will see that sort of acceptance in other areas.
So, and in fact, you're using the NIOSH method as a calibration standard for your direct read
Exactly,
equipment. Yeah.
exactly,
Got it.
exactly. Yeah, so we're hoping that we can continue to do that and have that be acceptable. But it'd be great if we could actually get direct reading instruments sort of calibrated in a way that our regulators will accept.
Yeah.
Bringing it all back to our original topic, really, of climate change, heat stress, wildfire smoke. I really wanted to get across to other people in the industry that we have to start thinking about how to approach these things in a collaborative way, and sort of learn from each other. So we have this at AIHCE, the conference that's coming up in May in Phoenix. We have this session that's on this very topic. It's on wildfire smoke and heat stress. And we're actually trying to elicit sort of a response from other industrial hygienists. We want people to tell us what's happening in their jurisdictions, what's sort of a best practice that's going on. What are you using for your wildfire smoke plans or your heat stress plans, et cetera? Because I know different jurisdictions are doing it differently. So we're trying to, like, as a community, learn from each other, because it's still a fairly emerging issue. And I think as industrial hygienists, we have a certain way of doing things that is that was really brought to light during COVID, right? We had never heard of hierarchy of controls before in the general media prior to COVID, at least I hadn't. So bringing that to light and using those skills, the ability to think through risk assessment and control, to these emerging issues, such as this climate change issue, in particular with the wildfire smoke and heat stress. I think if we can do that and start to frame it in the way we be framing all these sorts of hazards in industrial environments, if we can do that with these new emerging issues, then I think we can really help the world, really.
Sure.
We can really assist here. But I think it's learning from each other. So that's why I think discussions like this are really important, but also having the larger sort of session at AIHCE will be really useful, because I think people can actually provide what they're doing. What are their best practices? How can we learn from each other? Can we form some kind of community of practice around this issue? Maybe AIHA could do. I know there's There is a wildfire committee. Can we talk a little bit more about this issue, and how can we as a community really move that needle, I guess?
And I think it's really important for for your professions. I'm saying professions because I think there are a lot of individual verticals there, but to move this forward, because I think the general population is more attuned to air quality issues, environmental quality issues, coming off the pandemic, and having some of this terminology becoming normal terminology for even the general public. This, if you're going to move the needle, this would be the time. Uh,
Definitely.
because I think there's a little bit more intention on it, and certainly this is a problem that's not just a one-off issue. This climate change issue is progressively getting worse. The wildfire issues, I believe, will continue to accelerate, unless we can find some solution to that. So we are going to have to deal with this.
Right. And, we're talking about heat and wildfire here, but from a climate change perspective, we've been dealing with floods, right? And I know that there have been huge floods in California recently. This new term, it was a new term for me a couple of years ago, atmospheric river. It's, we've been hearing these new sort of weather terms, and and I really do think we're hearing about them more often now because of climate change, and we're dealing with the aftermath of those as well. The mold issues, the structural issues. So from a hygiene perspective, we also get involved on the sort of I guess the opposite end of the heat stress issue. And in many ways, it's during the winter where we get a number of these huge floods, a lot of snow melt, those sorts of things that happen.
Sure. I mean, these well, and they all tie together, and then certainly you're going to have landslides and those sort of things happening because you've burned off the vegetative cover,
All of
during
it.
the wildfire season, and now when
Yeah.
you have flooding, now it's more severe effects from that. It's just
Right.
it's
Right. So it sort
cumulative.
of compounds, right? And it all
Yeah.
sort of um, it all works together. You can't separate it one from another, right? So we're seeing those sorts of effects as well, and they're having huge effects here in British Columbia. But I do know, as I was following the news in California too, lots of flooding, snow in LA,
Mm.
that
Yeah,
that's
that's
wreaking
absurd.
havoc, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, and unfortunately, I think we're in for more of these extreme weather events coming forward. So it's really important that as a professional community, everyone here is looking forward and coming up with solutions, to dealing with these issues and these crises.
Yeah, and I think it all comes back to like some of those taking those skills as industrial hygienists that we have, coming up with plans, right? So disaster plans, what do you, contingency plans? What do you what are we going to do? How are we going to deal with things like that? And then um, I know people, have started putting together disaster plans and like pandemic plans and things like that over the last few years, but really thinking about all the different possible um, climate change effects, right? And thinking through how are we going to deal with that? What kind of plan can we have in place going forward? And even the smallest company, like my company, we can start to put together like plans around what would we do in that situation? How are we going to continue doing what we do?
So that's our show for this week. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new show. Until next time, I'm Bob Krell. Thanks again for watching and stay healthy.